You're listening to Family Talk, the radio broadcasting division of the James Dobson Family Institute. I am that James Dobson, and I'm so pleased that you've joined us today.
The following program is intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome back to Dr. James Dobson's Family Talk. I'm Roger Marsh, and on yesterday's broadcast, you heard the first of our three-part series of programs featuring decorated former U.S. Marine Chad Robichaux. Today, we're going to hear some of Chad's personal story and also hear about his battles with PTSD. In addition to his time with the U.S. Marines, Chad Robichaux is a former U.S. Department of Defense contractor with 8 deployments to Afghanistan. Following those deployments, Chad founded the Mighty Oaks Foundation, a nonprofit organization serving the active duty military veteran and the first responder communities around the world with faith-based combat trauma and resilience programs. Chad is also the co-founder of Save Our Allies, a nonprofit organization that focuses on the evacuation and recovery of Americans, our allies, and vulnerable people trapped in Afghanistan and now in Ukraine. Chad is also a best-selling author and has written a number of books related to veteran care and overcoming life's challenges. He is a Medal of Valor recipient for his bravery beyond the call of duty in law enforcement. He has earned an MBA from New York Institute of Technology and is a board-certified pastoral counselor with a focus on PTSD. Chad Robichaux is married to his wife, Kathy. They have 1 daughter, 2 sons, and 2 granddaughters. On yesterday's program, Chad shared about some of the things he has seen on his trips to Ukraine since the war broke out there. Today, he'll be sharing some of his own personal testimony. Here now is Dr. Tim Clinton to introduce his guests on today's edition of Family Talk.
Chad, welcome back to Family Talk. What an amazing program yesterday. And we got to pray that God would really be in the midst of all that's happening over in Ukraine with our leadership for such a time as this. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me back.
Most of you who are listening know that I have a deep love for those who have served, those who serve, and their families. I come from a pretty strong line of military patriots, was taught early on by my dad, who, by the way, was a World War II veteran, Chad. My dad served in the USS Navy. Actually, he was on the USS Pennsylvania, was in the South Pacific during World War II. Tom Brokaw called them the greatest generation ever because of their service, Chad. And he taught me that freedom wasn't free.
Absolutely. I mean, especially, when you watch young men and women go put themselves in harm's way. We have all volunteer military in the United States. Put themselves in harm's way for the cause of freedom. It sounds like you turn on the news and no matter what channel you watch, it feels like some of that's lost. But I tell you, it's not lost. Is young men and women raise their hand and make an oath every day to defend our Constitution, defend our way of life, defend our freedoms, and they're still bravely going on the battlefield to defend that for themselves here and for people around the world that can't defend themselves.
Through the years as a counselor too, and Chad, you know this. This is what your heart is all about. I've learned the toll or the impact that serving in the military, that war in particular can have on you. When you witness the atrocities of war, it can scar you deeply. And reintegration back into a civilian life, it can be more than hard, Chad. It can be brutal to try to reintegrate. The PTSD is real. When war comes home, it's a journey, and we're going to hear a lot more about that. Chad, everybody has a story. And you've got an unbelievable story. I want to go all the way back. You enlisted in the Marine Corps, I think, at age 17, basically to escape a pretty tough life growing up. Chad, take us back.
Yeah, growing up for me was, my father was a Marine. Both my sons are Marines. I was a Marine, so Marine Corps is a big deal in our family. All the way back to my uncle who served in World War II. So, over 80 years of service in my family. And for me, joining the Marine Corps was a second chance at life, a way to escape my childhood because my father was, a Vietnam veteran, very angry, a lot of physical abuse in our home. We had a lot of trauma in our family. My older brother, he was a year older than me. We had planned on joining the military together. He was and start training. We were planning on going special operations together. That was our kind of life goal, to escape that lifestyle. And when I was 14, he was 15. Tragedy hit our family. He was shot and killed It was devastating to me at the time. And I went into deep isolation, but kept that focus to join the military. And when I was 17, I enlisted in the Marine Corps. Within a year, I made it into special operations in the reconnaissance community. Made it into recon, went over the force recon eventually. And then after 9/11, I remember those planes flying to World Trade Center buildings. I'd been in almost 10 years. At that time, I was a sergeant at 3rd Force Recon Company, a team leader. And, watching that happen, watching those planes hit those buildings, I knew my life's about to be different. I'm about to do what I've been training the last 10 years to do.
Yeah.
And ended up going on a JSOC task force, a Joint Special Operations Command task force with the premier special operations unit in the world, in my opinion, in most people's opinion. And I had the privilege of serving there, representing the Marine Corps there. And that was my job. And my interpreter at the time was a man named Aziz, who did all 8 deployments with me. Incredible human being. He saved my life multiple times, at least 3 specifically, but probably every day. And we became very close, not just my interpreter, but became my teammate, my friend. I was there when his first 2 kids were born. I didn't go back to base when we went operating. I stayed in his home. So, Aziz and I became, family. Over the years, of being there and losing friends and doing difficult things, that anxiety that started to manifest in me in some different ways. And one of the things I think at first started to be frustration. I really believed that God wasn't present in Afghanistan. I believe that the presence of evil there, I'm mistaken with the absence of God, not knowing. And I felt like I had to make a decision in my life that, faith is something I could do later on when I get older. But right now I have to be a warrior, and I can't do both. And I believe this. I think this something that men, and probably a lot of young men, as people transition from boys to men, struggle with when they say, I have to trade my masculinity for my Christianity, and I'm not willing to do that right now.
Chad, I want to stay with that. 9/11 happens. Let me make sure I'm following the story here for a moment. You eventually deployed to Afghanistan. First couple of months there, you began to see the evil that you had been hearing about, the evil acts of the Taliban and more. Chad, I wanted to ask you, what did that start doing inside of your heart? Because this is a big part of your story. What kind of impact did it have on you? All that evil, brutal stuff you saw in Afghanistan. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
I manifested in hate. I became bitter, cynical. I began to hate the enemy, the Taliban. Had zero, and don't get me wrong, I still feel that good versus evil hatred towards the Taliban today. I even do, but the way I responded to that hate, the hate of evil, was different. And so I became I went into a very dark place. And I believe that decision to make the decision and not have God in my life because I thought that would bring a weakness in me, actually left a giant hole inside of me that I filled with that hate and that rage and that anger and bitterness, and that darkness really took over me. And I became a very angry person, very frustrated person, and I would even say not stable. I was able to do my job as a professional really well, but emotionally and mentally and even spiritually stable, I was not.
Chad, part of your story was there was a story in about a Toyota pickup truck following you. Chad, do you mind sharing some of this? Because, again, if you don't understand the wiring that's going deep inside people who begin to wrestle with the atrocities of war, you'll never understand PTSD. You'll never understand why they struggle so much here stateside and the reintegration piece that we're going to talk a lot more about. But take us back, Chad. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, so this particular day was myself, Aziz, and a Navy SEAL that was on our team, and we were in a Toyota Prado, which is like a 4Runner, and we were plain clothes. We each had a pistol, maybe in our waistband, but nothing much to defend ourselves. We weren't looking to get in any kind of contact. And so I noticed in my rearview mirror, I was driving a Toyota Hilux, which is like the national vehicle of the Taliban. All the Taliban drive these Toyota Hiluxes, and it was loaded with guys that looked like Taliban fighters. Big beards, tribal clothing. They were dusty. They all had AK-47 assault rifles, even had an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. And I was wanting to make sure they weren't following me. So in my training, we have what's called deviating your route. So I'm on Jalalabad Road and I make a right, and they continue to follow me. As I make the block and come back to my original route and turn on my original route, they turn and follow me, which let me know they were in fact following me. That also lets them know that I knew they were following me, which started a pretty aggressive pursuit. So they start trying to run us off the road, and I'm trying to get away from them. And I made a decision to go into the city of Kabul to try to lose them in the traffic. And we're going through all the traffic, and I'm banging into cars, and I made it to this major intersection called Masood Circle. And as I got to Masood Circle, the traffic began to congest and just stop, and it wasn't really anywhere to go. There was one little pathway I was trying to squeeze through, but as I did, that truck full of Taliban guys got in front of us and cut us off and roadblocked us in. And I remember when that happened, my passenger stepped out, and you could tell he was in charge. He was very calm, collective. He even took the time to close his door behind him. He had his AK-47 rifle in one hand. In his other hand, he gave me a hand signal to stop my vehicle and actually made eye contact with me. And in that moment, I knew we were in a very bad situation. This situation in our training and experience is called being stuck on the X. The X is an ambush site. It's a kill zone. A couple of rules you learn in training about the X is rule number one, you have to be able to recognize that you're on the X, right? You got to know you're in a bad situation. Rule number two, it's pretty simple. You have to get off the X. You got to move. Or something bad's going to happen. And I'm so thankful for military training because you train for every scenario. I'd every year go to a place called Bill Scott Raceway and drive counter pursuit training. And one of the situations is a roadblock situation. You execute a ramming technique. And so I hit my guys and I aimed my vehicle towards theirs, and it spun out of the way, and we were able to get off that intersection that day. And I don't know what those bad guys wanted, but I know this: if we'd have stopped on the X that day, if we'd have stopped on Masood Circle, we'd have put up a heck of a fight. But the truth is, we probably would have been killed or taken. And if I could fast forward a few years later, I came home from Afghanistan and found myself in that X again, dealing with anxiety and depression and debilitating panic attacks. And the difference this time is I didn't follow those two simple rules. I didn't want to identify that I was on the X because of my own pride or shame. And because of that, I chose not to get off the X and chose to stay there for a period of almost 3 years, and it almost cost me everything.
Yeah. Chad, while you're over there, again, you see things. You experience things that the human mind sometimes just can't put its hands around, if you will.
Especially the atrocities of children. That's like,
Yeah, Chad, I was just going to ask you about that because I know that there were a couple of times where there were young girls who you cared about, and you saw evil and hatred. Worse than that. You talked about how the Taliban would rape and beat many of these young girls. Some of them so bad that they would commit suicide by throwing themselves off the top of buildings. Chad, when you see that stuff, somewhere I think along the way what happens is you stop feeling.
Yeah,
explain that to us, that journey here.
Well, one, I will take a side note and say, unfortunately, that's happening again right now. These girls are 20 million women in Afghanistan, women and girls are being made into sex slaves right now. After the draw, but I could digress to that, but it's just so horrific to even think about. But yeah, when you see those things, I write a chapter in the book An Unfair Advantage about the girl in Chicken Street and this little street kid that we just so adorable and so sweet, and her being killed right in front of us, and then seeing the sexual molestation of little boys and little girls. It just really makes you want to do something about it, like something inside of you wants to solve it, but you can't. And so it's so frustrating. And so you see these things and then, happening to the innocent. And then you have friends that are lost. And I remember, some of we had 10 Afghans that worked for us that were captured and tortured and killed, and I was like, these are my family. Like, these are guys, like, I lived in their homes for like 3 years and was with their families and ate with their families and played with their kids, and they were killed because of working with me. And then had a vehicle bomb driven in my house to try to kill me and my friends, and like all these things happen, right? And there comes a point to where if you processed all that with the emotion that you and I have while we're sitting here today, we would lose our minds. We can't process that kind of emotion right now. So your body does something in your limbic system and your physiological effects of your body to shut down that emotion so that you can function in an environment. And a numbness comes over you, which at the time, I don't believe this is a mistake or a disorder or anything like that. God is allowing this to happen so we could function in an environment and survive, because if we felt all this emotion and empathy and pain or anxiety and stress, we would just shut down. We wouldn't be able to take it. So there comes a moment to where you have to have this thing shut off to be able to do your job and be safe and survive and help others. But there is a moment where you come home and those things don't just flip back on. You have to turn them back on, and most of us don't know how, and I didn't know how. And so I carried that numbness, that lack of empathy, that lack of compassion, that rational, reasonable emotion that we have when we see things that are sad or say something that we shouldn't say to our spouse or to our children that we should feel bad about, but we don't feel bad anymore. There comes a time to recognize that, and I'd say that's like an X, to recognize that, and then to be able to move forward off that X, and that's to be able to reprogram yourself and be able to turn those things back on, because we're not meant to live that way forever. Unfortunately, many veterans that experience those things live that way forever. And, many of the people kind of compare our generation right now with World War II veterans, and they're like, well, World War II guys, they came home and they just lived out their life and they never had any problems. No, they never turned back on. And many of them never turned back on, and we don't see a lot of the suicides, if you look back at those, until after they stopped staying busy with work and things they preoccupied themselves with. They never turn those emotions back on, and that's the sad reality for many veterans and many people who deal with PTSD outside of the veteran community.
Somewhere, Chad, you have to come back home, and you got to figure out how to reintegrate. Can you talk to us a little bit about that journey, what it looks like when war comes home? Because obviously, a lot of the work you do with Mighty Oaks Foundation and more is to help because of your story, because of what happened in your life. Chad, do you mind sharing a little bit of that as we set up some of tomorrow's program?
Yeah, obviously I eventually came home after 8 deployments. I was diagnosed with PTSD. I came home dealing with debilitating panic attacks to the point to where I think a lot of people use the word panic attack loosely, where they say I was in traffic and had a panic attack the other day. Not minimizing anyone's experience, but when I refer to panic attacks, it's the physiological effect of where I feel like I'm 1,000% convinced that I'm going to die at that moment. The level of people call 911 thinking they're having a heart attack, they're having that level of panic attack. And the only way I know how to describe it to people is imagine you were drowning in a swimming pool and handcuffed to the bottom, and the level of desperation you would have to get one breath of air, and that level of, but you never die, you never drown. You're that level of panic 24/7. That's where I was. In addition, I didn't like the medicine that they were giving me. I felt like it made me worse. I felt like either a zombie or I was going to die. I felt like the medicine was poisoning me. The counseling and none of that worked for me. I went to jiu-jitsu, which is a sport I've done since I was 5 years old, and went to professional fighting and won a world title. And so I had professional accolades and success and financial success, and none of those things changed my situation. And I went in about 3-year downward spiral, which ended with me separating from my family, in the relationships with other women. And on the surface, it looked extremely successful as a transition to be an athlete, but I never got well. And that ended with me being in my apartment in my home and making a decision that my family might be sad without me, but they would be better off. And I decided I was going to take my life. And you and I both know that same hopeless thought finds a heart in the homes of over 20 veterans every day. That maybe my family and my loved ones or friends would be sad without us, but they'd be better off. And so I would sit in my closet in my apartment. I had my family pictures I'd put on the floor around me. And I tried to build up the courage to put the gun to my head and pull the trigger. I had a Glock 22 pistol, a 40 caliber pistol. And something would happen, I believe it was divine. Every time I put that gun to my head to pull the trigger, I would have this thought that would come over me, and it was overwhelming, of who's going to find me. Like, someone's going to hear the gunshot, you're going to be missing, someone's going to find you. And the only other person who had a key to my apartment at the time was my oldest son, Hunter. And the thought of my son finding me that way was enough to pump the brakes in that moment. But I was in such a dark place, I'd be back at it, trying to build the courage up again. And it was one of those mornings, I was in that apartment, in that closet, and I heard a knock on my door. And when I did, I wasn't going to answer it. But when I heard my wife's voice announce herself, I panicked. I was ashamed of what I was doing. I hid that gun under a blanket, even though she would have never came in my apartment or my closet to see it. I hid that gun under a blanket, and I went and answered the door. And I was so irate that she was there interrupting me killing myself, which sounds twisted, but I was mad that she was interrupting that moment. And I started yelling at her. And in the middle, she's not a very calm person, but in that moment, she was extremely calm, and she asked me a question that radically changed my life. She's like, Chad, how could you do everything you did in the military? We met when we were 17 and 18, so she's seen me go through all that training and deployments and all that stuff. And she's like, how could you do all of that? Everything she's seen me do as an athlete in fighting, and how could you do all these things? But when it comes to your family, you'll quit. And there's no more soul-cutting question to me than me called the quitter, and that really challenged me. She was absolutely right. I've been successful at professional things in my life, but when it came to the most important things, being a husband, being a father, being a young 17-year-old kid that raised his hand and made a commitment to do something important with his life, I quit on all those things, including my will to live. And I made a pretty radical decision in that moment to get well. But the one thing I knew is that I couldn't do it with the people I surrounded myself by, and I couldn't do it with the people I had pretty much systematically surrounded myself by people that told me everything I wanted to hear and not what I needed to hear. I didn't have any accountability. So my wife had been going to this church, and and I'm like, wasn't interested in her church or anything, but I'm like, I need someone outside of my circle. So there's some man at your church that could help hold me accountable to this decision to put my life back on track. And it led me to a meeting with a man named Steve Toth. And Steve and I met at a Starbucks coffee shop, and Steve told me, I slid a plan over to him. I was going to fix my life, and he looked at that plan and slid it back over to me and didn't even read it. And he said, if this plan doesn't have anything to do with your relationship with God, I'm not going to waste your time, and I'm not going to let you waste mine. And in that moment, I knew that I had tried everything before: pills, counseling, VA programs, professional and financial success, but none of those things changed my situation. That led to a saying that we have in Mighty Oaks: if what you're doing isn't working, then why not try something different? And in that moment, I surrendered my life to Christ. And beyond that decision, Steve mentored me for an entire year in biblical living, and my life was radically changed.
And that is the story. It's an amazing story. If you haven't read Chad Robichaux's story, you need to do it. But Chad, I want you to close us out on, just help us understand, this is National Suicide Prevention Month. Everyone knows that we've got a real problem with our veterans, not only on PTSD. We need to learn a lot more about PTSD and how it's impacting our soldiers, those who served, and their families, and so much more. Chad, we need to understand homelessness, why in the world it's really prevalent among our veterans, and this suicidality issue. I mean, why? What in the world's driving it? And what are we going to do about it? Chad, closing word to you.
Yeah, I mean, this is a time, this month doesn't mean anything about more or less suicides. It's a month to be aware of it. And I think one of the awareness things is to realize how big of a problem this is in the United States and around the world. I mean, just since COVID, the National Suicide Hotline is up over 1,000%. People are dealing with a lot of hopelessness right now. It's okay to get news, but if your source of information and hope is in the news, if it's in politicians and political leaders, your hope's always going to fall short. We're always going to be let down by man. And so, in a time like this, it's a good time to reflect and realize that our hope needs to be in something bigger. And I believe there's no stronger hope than people that could step in their relationship with Christ and lead the lives they were created to live. I am an example of someone that tried literally everything to skirt around trying God. And what I realized is there is no substitute to fill that hole that I had in my heart. No matter how much success you throw into it and achievements and accolades, nothing fills that hole that God has that's made only for Him.
Our special guest again today has been Chad Robichaux. Chad is a former Force Recon Marine and Department of Defense contractor. 8 deployments to Afghanistan as part of a Joint Special Operations Command task force. He's also the founder of the Mighty Oaks Foundation, a leading nonprofit serving active duty military veteran and first responders communities around the world with highly successful faith-based combat trauma and resiliency programs. He's also co-founder of Save Our Allies. Chad, what an amazing story. And I love the but God piece, how God just changed everything. And Chad, I'm so excited about the ministries that you're involved with. And we so look forward to learning more about you and the amazing work God's doing in and through you tomorrow here on Family Talk. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Roger Marsh here once again to remind you that Chad Robichaux will be joining the program once again on tomorrow's broadcast, so make sure you tune in then to hear part 3 of his riveting story. Till then, if you'd like to learn more about Chad Robichaux, his amazing story, and his ministries, visit drjamesdobson.org/Family Talk, or you can email us at constituentcare@drjamesdobson.org. Before we go, did you know that Dr. Dobson writes a free monthly newsletter? In it, he tackles newsworthy topics and offers advice and encouragement for families in every stage of life. To sign up to receive Dr. Dobson's newsletter in the mail or via email, visit drjamesdobson.org or give us a call at 877-732-6825. Well, we're almost out of time for today, but I'd like to remind you that September is National Suicide Prevention and Awareness Month. Here at Family Talk and the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute, we know that sometimes life can seem too dark to bear, but the fact is there is help and there is hope. If you or someone you know is in a mental health crisis, call 988. That's 988 to reach the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. The Lifeline provides 24/7 free and confidential support for people in distress, prevention and crisis resources for you and your loved ones, and best practices for professionals in the United States. Again, that national toll-free number is 988. When you dial it, you'll reach a trained crisis worker who will listen to you, understand how your problem is affecting you, provide support, and get you the help you need. Well, I'm Roger Marsh, hoping you'll tune in again tomorrow to hear part 3 of Dr. Tim Clinton's fascinating conversation with Chad Robichaux. That's coming up right here on the next edition of Dr. James Dobson's Family Talk.
This has been a presentation of the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute.